Welcome. Good evening, everyone. My name is Franca Tamaris. I'm the Melbourne Energy Institute's Events Coordinator. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that today we are gathered on the lands of the Wurundjeri, Woy Wurrung and Boon Wurrung people, who have been custodians of this land for thousands of years, and we acknowledge and pay our respects to their elders past and present. We will have some time for Q&A with the panel. For our online audience, you may enter questions in the Q&A box in Zoom. For those in the room, we will fill these later in the session. We'll try and get through as many of your questions as we can. I would now like to hand over to Patricia Karvelas, who will act as moderator for tonight's events. Thank you, Patricia.
A bit shorter here. Hello, everyone. I'm Patricia Karvelas. I'm the host of Radio National Breakfast and the co-host of the Party Room podcast. I work at ABC News TV. I do lots of things. Can I just say tonight's seminar couldn't really be better timed, even though I don't quite think that was the intention. But given the week we're having on the energy debate and the transition and a radical and unprecedented intervention into the energy market, I just feel like this conversation is very prescient. This conversation is really about an economy-wide transformation to net zero emissions. Now, let's just think about net zero emissions for a minute. The commitment is net zero by 2050. And let's just remind ourselves that that's actually a bipartisan commitment now. So that is an Australia-wide commitment, whoever is elected, that we will reach net zero by 2050. Obviously, to get there, there's going to be a lot of work that has to happen. And that's what tonight's about, discussing what that work involves. It's going to require planning, building, financing of the infrastructure at a scale and a pace that is genuinely unprecedented outside wartime. And this forum is about expanding our understanding of what's needed, and in the Q&A, asking some questions, some difficult questions too, about what we aren't yet seeing to make that a reality. Joining us will be Professor Michael Brear, the Director of the Melbourne Energy Institute. Tony Wood is the Director of the Energy and Climate Change Program at the Grattan Institute. And Zoe Whitton is Managing Director and the Head of Impact at Pollination Group. It's a specialist climate change investment and advisory firm. So we're going to hear them all present, and then we'll have our Q&A, and you can ask some questions too. I'll begin by inviting Michael up. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Patricia, and hello, everyone. And I'm going to put my glasses on so I can see the presentation and not knock it off the table. I'll be talking just briefly this evening about a project that the University of Melbourne, University of Queensland, Princeton University and the NOUS group are working on at the moment, called Net Zero Australia. That's a link to a website that has everything about the work to date that we've done on it. And we're running this project. It's very much on this net zero challenge, both for our domestic energy system by 2050 and also for our exports as well, which are 2.5 times the energy that we currently consume domestically. So big numbers for exports. This project's has been running for about 1.5 years. We're wrapping it up next year. It's a completely open process. So all of our input assumptions, our methodologies, everything is on that website. And we warmly encourage you to go through that detail if you have the time, or if you're an insomniac. And we also encourage you to contact us with any feedback, because we take into account that feedback and we improve the modelling as we can when we've received feedback to date and as we're going forward. So, but to give some idea, today I'll talk mostly about the scale of the challenge, the decarbonisation challenge. And you know, Tony and Zoe will talk about other things, and in our Q&A later on, we'll probably broaden the discussion somewhat. So I'll just show a few slides on the scale of the challenge. These are the kinds of results that the Net Zero Australia project gets for the domestic energy system. We're looking here just at electricity, and we're looking at a whole bunch of different scenarios, and this goes up and that goes down and so on and so forth. But to give you an idea of the scale of the challenge, we're seeing that, for example, we're going from about 25 gigawatts of wind and solar today to, by mid-century, having 400 to 500 gigawatts So that's more than a factor of 10 growth. That's renewable generation. It's onshore wind, it's offshore wind, it's solar on our rooftops, it's big solar farms, all the good stuff. And it's more than a factor of 10 growth to supply the electricity that the nation will use. Now that's just across what we currently call electricity, but of other things, you know, increasing electrification of transport, increasing electrification of our homes, so on and so forth. So big growth in electricity generation to serve the entire economy, not just what we currently can use for, as electricity. Then we also see a lot of other stuff. We see lots and lots of batteries, 50 to 100 gigawatts of batteries going in. And interestingly, as we shut down coal, we see other firm kinds of generation, pumped hydro, gas turbines, and other things still playing a significant role. So there's real heterogeneity, but the take-home message is an awful lot of building. If we think about a map of the country, what might this country look like? Now, the turn of phrase we used at our August launch of this event was the future is not what we model it to be, it's what we choose it to be. If we want it to be net zero and then how we get there, these are big decisions that the nation needs to make. And for example, in one case here, this is for a case where we have very strong electrification of the nation. And we can see here some, you know, really massive assets going in. We've got of order 2,000 gigawatts of solar PV. Remember, that compares to 25 or so gigawatts of renewables we have at the moment. This enormous number, bigger than the 400 to 500 gigawatts of renewables I showed earlier, is because we're now factoring in energy exports, okay? That big number, the rest of the world use us more than we use ourselves. 150 gigawatts of onshore wind, 50 gigawatts of offshore wind, and transcontinental transmission, east, west, north, and south. When we first started getting these results, we thought, oh no, Mr. Kemlani would be interested in this if he was still about. Is that right? We've looked at it. We can't see where our modelling isn't right. So these are the kinds of results we're getting. And you can see here these enormous renewable assets across the Sunbelt, providing green hydrogen, which is taken to the port by transmission pipe, turned into ammonia in this modelling, could be anything else, and then shipped to Japan, to China, to Korea, to India, elsewhere, where they currently consume our thermal coal, metallurgical coal, and LNG. Even bigger numbers. When we think about costs, I apologise for swapping between domestic and export systems. The export costs, well, they should be paid for by our customers. They give, you know, our big energy providers, our big energy exporters, big long-term contracts worth billions and billions of dollars, and our energy providers build big things to service that demand. So that shouldn't come off our electricity bills. But for our domestic energy system, we will pay for that, and we should pay for that. So if we wish to achieve net zero emissions, what will it cost us domestically? Well, here's some cases here. You see, from 2020 out to 2060, a reference case, that's essentially the do nothing case. That's the forget about climate change case. There's no net zero objective. All the other cases are all detailed variations on a tune, the tune being net zero emissions for our domestic and export systems. I won't go into the detail of each of those scenarios because we don't need to, because they actually give pretty similar total costs. And these are what we call average costs or levelized costs. I won't talk about those subtleties. Zoe might talk about it later on, because when we talk about investments, individual things, but these are the average costs per annum that we expect to expend. And this is with pre-COVID and therefore pre-Ukraine costing of pretty much everything, wind farms, oil, gas, so on and so forth. But we see if we go back to a pre-COVID-like energy world, wouldn't that be lovely for our electricity and gas prices? If we go back to that, we're talking about going from about 100 billion bucks per annum that we currently spend on our energy system, rising up to 175 or so over the transition. So a significant increase in total cost, but there's a big but. A lot of that is just servicing increased demand because our nation gets bigger. So if we normalise that by current GDP and projected GDP, they don't necessarily result in higher total system costs relative to GDP, provided these fuels, these equipments, all these things continue to get cheaper as people are projecting, and maybe hopefully the Ukraine war ends and the world goes back to more sensible energy commodity prices. We hope that's the case. Now, just to bring it home, and before I hand over to Tony, I just wanted to give a little snapshot of what it might mean for us, very personally, indicative home investments. So this is for a case where we would have what we call strong electrification. We call that the E+ scenario in some of our earlier slides. And here we're talking about sort of things that you should see at home by when, if we wanted to achieve stronger electrification domestically as part of a net zero transition. So we're talking about, for example, half of all cooktops and ovens being electric by 2030 across the nation, right? That's not new sales, that's half in our homes. When was the last time you bought a cooktop? I haven't bought one for 15 years, right? So we've got to get them in, and we've got to get half of them in our homes being electric by 2030. What about our air conditioning and heating? Well, we need half of all of them in our homes to be fully electric by 2045 or so. Our water heating, more rapid electrification. Our lighting, lots of people have LED lighting now, but once again, rapid deployment. The EV ones is perhaps the most stark. By 2030, new sales need to be half fully electric, and by late 2030s, half of all cars on road need to be fully electric if we went this kind of route. Now, there are other ways to get there, I'm not saying which one's better, which one's worse, but this is one case. And then, of course, washing, drying, all the other stuff that we do in our homes. But here's the key thing, right? We're talking about here, and if you're lucky enough to be a professor at a university on a good salary, I can go and put a battery in my house. I can go and buy an EV. I can go and put an induction cooker in my home. But not everybody earns what I earn. And so who should pay if we want to achieve this? And who's going to win and who's going to lose? They're the things that scare politicians. And they certainly scare many of us when we're doing this work as well. So I'll hand over to someone more brave than I am, Tony Wood. Thank you.
I don't think I've ever been called brave before, Michael. That's a bold or annoying, but not brave. Look, you don't have to look very far, or you can look far, and you'll see two things. See the same thing, I'm sorry. And that is that energy is political, geopolitical, local political. The last slide that Michael had up, I think Adam Bant must have seen, because he was the one negotiating with the Prime Minister about getting an electrification policy in place in support for what he's trying to do about gas. So if we're going to do this, there's going to be issues which are very political. Australia, arguably more than most countries, has been through a climate war. I don't think we've declared peace yet, and we'll see how that plays out. But to do this, the sort of stuff Michael's talking about, there's some interesting political issues, and I'm just going to cover 2 or 3 of those in the next 10 minutes. I think my slides are a little simpler than Michael's, but I'm not sure about that. And they're certainly not based upon on the extent of modelling that was done by that group. What this is, this chart here is based upon numbers that were published by the Commonwealth Government only a couple of weeks ago. They're the latest projections to, I tell one small fib. The extension beyond 2030, which is in the middle of this chart, is basically extension of a straight line to net zero by 2050, which is what we're talking about today. The rest of it was published a few weeks ago. It's an update on Australia's annual emissions. Around about 500 million tonnes a year is where they've been, and you can see that they're coming down. The latest numbers, these are, as I said, published only very recently, would suggest that we're looking like we'll be about 32 million tonnes a year below 2005 levels by 2030. And if they do some of the things the government's already committed to doing, we'll be 42 million tonnes below 2005 levels by 2030. Bad news is that we're still not the numbers that we have to be on the straight line. So even with the policies the government's committed to already, at the additional measures, we've got some ways to go. And that's the story that I want to talk a little bit about, was what do we have to do? Now, when you look at, and by the way, I think that the thing about this is what policies are going to achieve these sorts of things. Targets are one thing, but dartboards without darts isn't a very interesting game. And so what policies are going to actually allow us to achieve these targets is going to be important, and I'll come back to that. So when you look at the sectors of the economy, life gets a little bit more interesting. These are the same numbers, but disaggregated slightly. So in this case, I've only taken them out to 2035 because that's all that was published. And you look at each of these sectors: electricity, stationary energy, transport, fugitive, agriculture, and so forth. Only one of these is coming down. You do not need a sophisticated analysis to look at that chart and not recognize which one it is. And we've made significant progress on electricity emissions, but we're not making the progress we need on anything else. And if we are going to achieve net zero by 2050, and certainly if we're going to achieve 43% by 2030, we need to bend some lines pretty damn quickly to be on the sort of pathway that Michael was talking about. Now, we are not going to get back to an overarching policy framework. It's just not politically doable. Maybe one day we'll eventually get back to where we should be with an economy-wide carbon price and say, why don't we start from there? But Australia's a world leader in trying stuff and throwing them away on energy and climate change policy. We've thrown away more climate change policies than just about anyone else in the world. And maybe we'll come back to where we started eventually. Electricity has come down as a result of policies and subsidies, an interesting combination of both, partly driven by the Commonwealth, partly driven, probably more driven, you would say, more recently by the states. And it's expected to continue to come down. The trick, of course, it will get harder because we've done the easy bit. The easy bit was connecting to the grid where it is now and putting stuff on our roofs, as Michael talked about. And we've still got the hard bit to do. But industrial emissions is really hard. Emissions from industrial activity in total, in this chart, they're broken up slightly between fugitive emissions, industrial processes, and stationary energy. They will be a bigger source of emissions than electricity within the next 2 years. And that's going to be hard. Now, that is subject to a policy that the current government is working on called the safeguard mechanism. And we'll see, because that is going to be, if not quite as open a dispute between the government and industry as we're seeing around gas, but there will be a lot of disagreement about how that's going to work. Behind this are industrial emissions are two very important sectors. One is coal mining and the other is liquefied natural gas extraction. And we're talking about domestic emissions, not what happens when this stuff gets exported. They are significant and they're even growing slightly. And so if we don't do something about those, it's challenging. And there's only one way to reduce emissions from coal mining. That is to stop coal mining. There's only one way to stop burning natural gas, and that's to stop burning natural gas. And yet when you start that conversation, you end up with some difficult places with some people who don't like it very much. Transport, we're still struggling to even consider emission standards for our vehicles. Why we're in that position is almost mind-bogglingly idiotic, but we're still struggling. And maybe the current government will get there with the EV strategy. Agriculture, well, burping and farting cows and sheep is tricky. Certainly in Australia, where most of them are free range, they're not in nice feedlots where you can get seaweed to them, seaweed additives. And then you've got another interesting piece of work, which is, well, what if this doesn't work and we get to net zero? We've got to offset the emissions that are left. There's only three things you can do to offset emissions that I know of. One is plant trees, one is to stick the carbon in the soil, and the other one is to suck the emissions out of the CO2 out of the atmosphere and bury it someplace. All of those are either very expensive or problematic from an environmental question perspective, or both. And Professor Ian Chubb is currently having a look at those. So that looks pretty interesting. So what's going on with the policies? Well, the Commonwealth government was elected with only a couple of policies because they took what they thought was going to be a small policy agenda to the election. That they didn't know was they're going to be faced with the incredible increases in prices we're grappling with now. But they've got this Rewiring the Nation Corporation. That is basically money they're going to try and use to really kickstart the development of the build out of the transmission grid that's necessary if we're going to connect all those renewables that Michael was describing. It's going to be really hard because even if they do throw $20 billion at it, physically getting this done is very difficult. They've got this thing called the safeguard mechanism, to which I've already referred. They've got another thing called a capacity investment mechanism. Now, I won't even bother to try and explain to you what that is, but basically what it's saying is, what do you do when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining? How do you make sure you've got the capacity to deal with that? We'll see how that plays out. The ministers met last week. It didn't get the same attention it might have done because of all the stuff going on with gas and electricity pricing, but that's going to be one to watch because it will make a huge difference to whether or not we can maintain a reliable grid while we go up to very high levels of renewables. Certainly the 82% renewables the government wants. We do have, and the government is looking at developing an electric vehicle strategy. They're doing it almost unbelievably cautiously. In 2017, Josh Frydenberg, when he was minister, basically said we need to have emission standards because people will be saving money by 2022. We're now in 2022 and those people are not saving money because we didn't do what he was suggesting back then, because partly, not only did his political party, the coalition, not want to go down that path, but also because the industry didn't want to go down that path. Now that's the second part's changed. The industry is now saying we need to do this. And so the question is, can Labor find a coalition to be able to make that work? Because EV strategy is going to be part of that, bending the curves I mentioned before. And then we've also got, because we don't have any capacity to have an economy-wide carbon price, we don't have an overarching policy framework. The Climate Change Authority, which was set up by Kevin Rudd, pretty well emasculated by the Abbott government, is now being rejuvenated, and more resources have been put into that. And they will be given the task of thinking about how these things might actually stick together and what sort of emissions reduction we could expect in each of those pathways. Now, Australia's energy system used to be pretty separated between federal and Commonwealth, federal and state. The federal government would worry about trade and exports, LNG, coal exports, that sort of stuff. The state governments would worry about domestic policy. Climate change started that moving in a different direction. When Kevin Rudd was elected as Prime Minister, the states who were working on their own emissions trading scheme said, oh, that's fine. Labor's got it. We can exit the playing field. And they did. They will never do that again. They will never do that again. And so now you've got this tension between the federal and state governments around climate policies and renewable energy targets. Now, Chris Bowen, who's really trying to do doing a pretty good job of stitching it together, has got them all kissing and making up and being good friends, has got a challenge, so he's got to keep them together. Because the history of the federal system is they do fall apart. Something will happen where they can't agree. And we'll see how that works, because right now, they do have to be stitched together if we're going to make that work. I think we do have, at the state level, a lot of work being done on not the interstate longer transmission lines, but more the inside the state transmission lines that connect the renewables to the cities of Melbourne and Sydney. Again, very, very challenging. In Victoria, even more so, because no one seems to be able to work out who's going to do what. And the answer is no one's done very much so far as a result of that. But there's some ways to go to catch up. The states are doing more about on the EV side. That is, they've got rebates and various forms of infrastructure. And the states are probably doing right now a bit more on hydrogen than the Commonwealth. So whether these things could be made to sit together is one question. And finally, it seems to me that where we are in 2022, and for this term of this government, there is an opportunity to create some real momentum, because we do know that the windows close very quickly. And the window that was open for Kevin Rudd closed, the window for Albanese is open now, and he needs to take advantage of that. That we may make some real progress, and we may even get tentative bipartisan support. We'll see. Business is on side, the community is on side, and that makes a huge difference politically. The sort of stuff that's going on now, Albo will get support for. We don't have to set our next international target for 2035 for a couple of years yet, but the government will almost certainly set that target before the election, so they can go to the election with a more ambitious target for emissions reduction by 2035. I think, as I said before, integrating federal and state policies will be difficult, not because they don't like each other, but because there will always be tension. And maybe, not necessarily in this government's term, but maybe the next government, we may see a return to where we should have started in the first place. And we'll say, well, why don't we start from there and get on with life? We'll see. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I have to say that that last hope is one, Tony, that I've heard from you before and heard from many others who've been in the industry longer than I have. And you know, maybe we'll get there. Maybe we're on a different path. We'll see. So I'm just going to whiz through a few things because I know we want to get to panel discussion. And I would make these comments from the angle of them being comments from the field. So most of you won't know anything about pollination, but the short version of what we do is we spend a lot of time trying to help people build solutions to all this, working with large corporates, working with large finance providers, working with governments. And so reflecting on this, I'm reflecting on it from the perspective of having spent the last little moment trying to negotiate all the difficult bits and pieces that involve actually getting it to land. And I liked that you got the how do we bend the curve piece in there, Tony. The first thing I wanted to reflect on actually is to your point about having been in a lot of conversations, difficult conversations with people who don't like you. It is nice that we at least are in a place where we no longer need to convince capital markets, which is where I primarily work, to do this. We just need to help them figure out how to do it. That wasn't the case even 5 years ago. We roll up and have conversations about transition and everyone would look at you like you had two heads, and also like it was completely insensible that this would ever be a thing that anyone tried to do. That's not the case anymore. We are now in a state where we have, whether it's real or not real, a huge amount of capital lined up saying, I'd like to get behind this type of activity. That's not grant funding, that's commercial funding, and we'll get to that. But nonetheless, that's a materially different circumstance than we found ourselves in 5 years ago even. So what I'm going to talk about is there enough money? We've talked about that a little bit before. What's going to be hard? What's going to continue to be hard for the next few decades? And what steps can we take, at least at the outset? That has not done what yeah, it has, good. So we talk a lot about, and Michael mentioned this before, whether or not there's enough money for transition, because we often look at the numbers and we go, my word, they're huge. It's extraordinary. How on earth do we handle this type of spending load? The interesting thing about it is that it's not necessarily actually, it is an increase in spending, but it's more importantly a shift in spending. So what you're looking at here on the left-hand side is the change in spending on different parts of the energy system. This is global, between a bunch of net zero-ish scenarios and what you might call an old school business as usual case. And the thing you can see is that everything on the left-hand side is going up. You're spending more money on it. Everything on the right-hand side is going down. That's extraction and fossils. You're actually just moving money. And that's not easy. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But that's the first thing I want to take away from this slide. The second thing is this is a slightly different version of the same data, or a different presentation of the same data. And the two columns you've got here are your below 1.5 scenario with no overshoot. And the other is your sort of classic 4 degrees. And the thing that I'd want to highlight is on the right-hand side, you can see the total numbers. The 1.5 number is a bit higher, but it's not an order of magnitude higher. And in fact, a lot of the time when we talk about a huge increase in spending, it's in the electricity system, which is the second from the right. So we do actually probably have enough money to do this. The question is, how do you get the money to line up where you need it? So if we talk about that for a minute, these are a few of the things that, at least in our present experience, are proving to be quite a challenge. And they're all huge, so I'm not going to do any of them proper justice, but just to get them out there for the conversation. The first one is actually just negotiating the value transfer. So a lot of you will have heard conversations from people from Tony through to Saul Griffiths saying, you're moving wealth around. You're moving who gets to earn and where that money is earned around. And that's sort of straightforward when you do it in a model, but it's hard when you do it in real life. It's really interesting in the latest IPCC reports. There's a little comment there that says, you know, we've seen great progress with the price of new energy technologies, but interestingly, we've seen greater progress with the price of new energy technologies that have modular aspects. And that's partially a manufacturing feature, but I suspect it is also a feature of deployment. It is easier to deploy something when you don't have to spend $7 billion on it and get 65 environmental approvals to do so. So this value shift piece seems to be working better at the moment in parts of the economy when the where you can do it at a smaller scale and you don't have to sanction it. Within this, the need to invest proactively is particularly difficult. We deal with a lot of startups, energy startups particularly, and I know a lot of you will as well. And one of the things that we constantly deal with in that space, and I should say we deal with pilot projects as well, is people saying, look, I know this is going to be needed in 10 years' time. Don't get me wrong. I've read all the reports these guys have produced. I'm really excited about it. That's why I'm here. But I don't have a revenue case that I can say was there today in the past that I can do a model on and say, this is my investment case. So even though I know I've got to do it, and even though I know everyone's going to need it, I don't either have the existing revenue support or a historical way of saying I've had the revenue support to get through the investment case. Most investment cases, as you guys will know, depend on either historical or existing revenue support. And at the moment in transition, we're trying to invest before knowing that, which is a new exercise for us. We've done it before for space races and a few other things. Silicon Valley is used to doing it, but we're certainly not used to doing it here. Another problem we have is creating enough assets, and the others have touched on this, so I'll just talk about it very briefly. Creating a new asset or a new company, and I talk about them as assets, but solutions, projects, infrastructure, whatever. Basically, you need people who are ready to do it and get behind it. You then need contractors or staff. You need regulators who are ready to approve it fast enough. You need governments and other partners who will provide the infrastructure you need for it. And you need the technologies to facilitate it. Now, if you're China, you can do this piece by piece and you don't need all those things to line up at once. You can build a whole bunch of green energy in the middle and then not really have great utilization factors for a while you connect it up to the demand centers on the coast, but you can get there and it's okay. And no one shoots you for spending the money in the interim. But it's a bit difficult to do here. You have to line all these things up at once. So one of the big complaints we get from everyone is there's not enough asset creation. We would love to put capital down, but there's just not enough asset creation. We can't get the poles and wires in the ground fast enough to deploy the cash. The final thing here, and it's no small problem, is navigating closure. Capital markets and the contracts that sit underneath them are not very well developed for navigating closure. We've had this conversation about AGL about 28,000 times, but inside all of the AGM results for things like AGL is a back and forth, which basically says, are shareholders allowed to sign off on you shutting down an asset? I think in 5 years' time they will be, but right now they're trying to figure out whether or not that's something they're even allowed to think about doing. Now, if we throw this out a little bit and think about this in the next few decades, one of the big issues we've got is we've got a big gap between what I might call demand inertia, which is basically what your existing revenue data tells you people are going to spend money on, and ambition. And what you can see here on the left is what you might call demand inertia. That's the steps scenario, IEA step scenario. It won't happen, but it's what would happen if things didn't keep changing all the time. It's what historical demand is telling us would happen. So when you do an investment case, that's often what you put in at first. The middle is what we need. This is the net zero emissions scenario from the IEA. We've all got issues with it, but nonetheless, it's an interesting view on what you might need. And on the right is basically something we made up, but this is implied by the UN high-level expert group's most recent report on sufficient net zero targets for non-state entities, that's companies. And that basically says you stop spending on that stuff entirely before 2035 and you get the volume out. And capital markets are navigating this gap. So on one side, every time you want to do an investment case, you do it based on the left, but everyone who wants to make you commitments is doing the commitments based on the right. And trying to get to the in-between of those two things is the challenge capital markets have now, and it's the challenge that governments have and companies looking into capital markets have to navigate. It's not going to get easier. Our insistence on the case on the right is going to get sharper and sharper the more we live through climate change, to Tony's earlier point. And the final thing I just want to talk about is, what do you do to unlock all of that? I actually always put the term unlock capital in brackets. A lot of people, and many of you will have been to COPs, and you'll know that everyone's favorite word for the last 10 years is unlocking capital. How do we unlock finance for things? I think unlocking capital often imagines that finance is a thing that is a grant program, as opposed to a huge commercial system that has to obey a lot of commercial laws. And so at the moment, the pathways we see to unlocking capital actually have a lot more to do with unlocking new economic activity. And the big barriers that sit here, there is a little bit about capital market innovation. Don't get me wrong, we can talk about that. But the big barriers that we see to unlocking economic activity are revenues. So actually getting demand support in place. Certainly Australia is not alone, getting a little bit more alone, but historically not alone in liking to have climate policy that does everything but make people spend money on solutions. You'll line up the disclosures and do all the stuff around the edges, but you often don't actually want to force people to change what they spend money on because no one likes that. It's not politically very viable. We need revenue support. We need revenue support for solutions, and that unlocks capital. The second thing I'd note is capability. We've all touched on it, but it can't be underemphasized. It is going to be really difficult to do this, whether it's environmental approvals, whether it's getting the boats to put the offshore wind in place, it's going to be really hard. And so everything we need to do has to happen with a mindset towards capability. How do we actually physically get it done? And finally, there is a space for new models, new financing models. A lot of you will be hearing about, and a lot of you will have experience in, blended finance, which is basically new varieties of government taking bits and pieces of risk so that private capital can crowd in without having to completely redefine itself. That's one pathway, but I would flag a potentially bigger pathway here, which I think there's a reflection of in the rise of infrastructure financing. We will probably find new models of deploying private capital against this type of infrastructure, particularly energy infrastructure as an asset class. But we're not going to do it fast enough to unlock the capital to make all of this happen without the accompanying economic activity. Once you get the economic activity going, then you basically get to go at scale. So I think that's it from me. But the thing I just want to close on is that what this requires basically is focused industrial policy. Not a thing we're very good at, to Tony's point. So the big question for me is, can we get organised? Can we not only bridge the connection from state and federal, but can we go from electricity and also bridge to industry? I'm not sure we can, but I think it's the challenge that's been put ahead of us for transition, at least in this country.
Well, I'm going to invite you all into your chairs, my friends. And I feel mixed feelings after hearing all your presentations. I'll be honest, I think I'm channeling the audience. I feel a great sense of optimism about the fact that this is being modelled and there are financial models and there is a trajectory, but I also feel great levels of despair that a lot of things have to go right and a lot has to potentially change quickly. So Michael, I'm going to start with you. And, you know, I found your presentation really interesting, and the trajectory we have to be on has to obviously really accelerate. How fast do we need to accelerate by 2035 in order to actually get there? And are we being realistic about just the amount of work that needs to be done in that interim period? I mean, under the previous government before the election, you know, always talked about 2050, and there was all these technology solutions we didn't even know about that were all going to sort of come together just before 2050, and this would all just happen. I think we think that's not the case now, and this government's taking a different approach. But are the policy settings right to get us there by 2030, 2035?
Policy settings aren't there yet to get us there.
Not sure why we're getting so much feedback.
We are getting feedback. I'm going to
Looks
turn
like
mine
I'm
off.
about to get into trouble. Okay, all good. Yeah.
We'll play off and on. But you're dead right. We need to accelerate dramatically. It's an immense transition, and we work this project every single day, and we keep underestimating how big it is. Look, I haven't presented job numbers, for example. The federal government's target by 2030, we think, needs probably about a tripling or a quadrupling of number of people working in the sector by 2030. So that means, you know, universities, TAFEs, we need to be producing those graduates right now, for example, in order to get there. So it is an immense acceleration, but we have to normalise that acceleration by reference it, I should say, rather than normalise, by transitions that have happened previously. In the last 30 years, we've built from nothing an LNG industry, which is about a quarter of all the energy we export. And we're talking about a transition now, the next 30 years compared to the last 30 years. None of us had a mobile phone 20 years ago, let alone email 30 years ago, let alone many things, home internet. So if we reference the future transition by what we've already done, then yes, it is an immense transition, but perhaps it's not as scary as we might think it is when we think about these massive generational and nation building things that we have done previously.
Tony, you said that we've done all the easy stuff. So the low hanging fruit has been picked, which makes sense. You see the fruit, it's close to you, you pick it, and then you want to move on. But just be transparent with us about the political challenges still. You said the climate wars weren't over, and I agree with you. And in fact, I watch Question Time for my sins every single time it's on. And the opposition consistently asks questions of the rewiring the nation policy, where this will happen, which towns, which paddocks will be affected. It's been quite politicised, even that part of the transition piece. Are you worried that we're not going to get there even at that part?
Well, I obviously didn't commit as many sins as you have, Patricia, because I don't watch listen to Question Time every day. Look.
And we called him brave before.
Right now, the challenge to the opposition is, I think, it's both clueless and irrelevant. That may not last very long. And every time there's a new government, particularly when it decimates the previous government, it looks like the world has shifted on its axis politically. And it's amazing how quickly politics can change back again. And this is a window that I think is only going to be open for a short time. Now, it may not be. I mean, maybe that this goes on for longer. But I think if this government can show by the next election that it's making a real progress, it's going to be so much harder for the opposition to put up an alternative. And the alternative at the moment is, well, what about nuclear? I mean, I don't have a problem with nuclear, but it doesn't seem like a particularly great solution. This is...
You mean economically viable?
Exactly. Now, this is the biggest economic opportunity Australia has ever seen in front of us. And we can do this, as Michael was saying. And as though it was, the money is not going to be... Getting money is not the real issue. How it plays out, how risks are managed is an issue. And we wrote a report about industry policy this year. It says, look, we need a fundamentally different industry policy, one where government and industry actually work together. Not what we're seeing right now playing out between the government and the gas industry, but one where industry and government actually cooperate, and maybe even governments participate more actively. Just don't provide capital grants all over the place, but actually invest, actually provide equity, actually share some of that risk. Then we might have some chance of achieving this.
Okay, that's perfect segue. Thank you to Zoe. Governments being the partners, and we've seen that with some of these projects, right, already, and some of the announcements, the underwriting is happening. Do you need an acceleration of that from the Commonwealth? Is that wise, and would it unlock some of the capital that you talk about?
You do partially, and don't get me wrong, it is useful, and in the structure of the system you're trying to set up, it does help you mobilize capital, I would say, on the margins. Now, a good example of this, we've been quite famous in Australia for not doing too much except for the Clean Energy Finance Corporation arena. And so 5 years ago, when we used to turn up to things and we would say, we've done something, and we'd often say, what's the CFC? It's so great. We always used to turn up overseas and tell people that it was the biggest green bank in the world, which was true. We just didn't have much else in the bag. And the CFC has been really, really effective in the work that it does, which is basically making those pilot scale or even large scale installations and projects slightly more likely, getting them over line, just, getting them into the bounds of likelihood. But I think I just want to riff off what Tony just said. There's a bigger piece there about industrial policy, because a lot of blended finance, let's call it that, operates on the margins. You know how to build the solar thing. You know how to approve it. Someone's just about to sign off on it. They're sort of, they're almost there.
they know the infrastructure, they're used to putting money down against that type of stuff. And then the government comes along and says, look, we'll just take the first piece of risk and then you guys can, get out of the way and you guys can make it happen. So blended finance often works really well in that type of context. But blended finance is not by itself going to help you build the Danish wind industry in Australia. And I don't mean to say lots of wind. I mean to say we talk a lot about being a superpower, renewable energy superpower, it's the greatest opportunity for us ever. You don't capture those opportunities by making slightly more financing available. You capture those opportunities by putting a systematic series, a policy infrastructure in place that says, look, I know we need to make the new technologies and then scale them. And then we might need to manufacture some of them and then they will go into the pilot plants and those will need approvals and those will need infrastructure. You actually need the whole system to come together in order to do this at the type of speed that we're at least imagining and talking about. And interestingly, when you look at other jurisdictions, this kind of blew my mind. We did a big piece of work on this recently. The level of integrated industrial policy infrastructure that you need to create California's EV industry or Denmark's wind industry or the new, I don't quite know what to call it, clean ag industry that's coming out of the Netherlands is pretty extraordinary compared to the type of stuff that we in Australia are used to doing. And no surprise, the number of the places I just mentioned have had to do it before. And so they've had to build the policy infrastructure to stand those new industries up. So I think blended finance helps a bit. And don't get me wrong, we're going to need more PPPs and all the other type of stuff. But we're also going to need to build new industries and a few new industries across the next few decades. And we're probably going to have to get proactive about it.
That's interesting. So how do we get proactive about it, Michael? I mean, I think there's a real consensus. Everyone would agree in the audience, I think, that there needs to be this kind of industry policy macro approach is what you're calling for. What does that need to look like that differs to what we currently have? Clearly, this government has an enthusiasm for everything that you guys are saying. I mean, I've chaired these sorts of panels with Chris Bowen, and he uses a lot of the same language you're all using. But what does that policy setting at a macro level with the states and the territories look like to accelerate it?
I think it's enormous. I'll just tackle two parts of it though, Patricia. There's biodiversity as an Indigenous estate. There's many, many things you need to think about, not just the winners and losers at home and other things. So, but going back to risk and capital markets and also onshoring of manufacturing of a whole bunch of different stuff, I think the management of risk is going to be a really big thing that governments have to just continuously support, because, to Zoe's point, I think you said shutting down good assets. We're shutting down things that work because they don't work quite the way we want them to work. They emit, but they produce the energy we want. And we're going to replace them with other things that provide us with exactly the same energy, but in a different way. And someone has to make that investable on behalf of the people because we want to do this transition. So that's not going to be the private sector. That someone has to make that investable and manage that risk. Replace something that's perfectly good, a banger, an old car, with an expensive, more expensive thing, which does it the same service. So that risk management role, I think, is just very substantial and needs to be long-sighted and continuous. But when we start building these hundreds of gigawatts of this stuff, something we haven't looked at yet is what that then necessarily means for actually building an offshore wind turbines in Australia, not because we just want to create jobs in Victoria or New South Wales or anywhere else, but because the Danes and the Japanese haven't got enough to sell to us in order to do this. So there'll be lots of those kinds of pressures as well: solar panels, inverters, batteries, so on and so forth. So there is a whole secondary thing, which is tremendously exciting. And looking at that, part of me, but maybe this is just because I'm an engineer and I've been in the sector for an increasingly long time, a lot of that's back to the future. We did post-Second World War, a lot of that thinking is back to the future. Post-Second World War, before the container came along and transformed what we could move around the world globally, we justified a domestic car industry, agricultural machinery, many things manufactured in Australia because it was expensive to move them from other parts of the world to Australia. maybe some of those pressures manifested a different way will potentially rejuvenate some of that activity. But I'm always cautious about saying that, because a professor of mechanical engineering loves nothing more than the thought of lots of young mechanical engineering and engineering graduates going off to good jobs to make things.
I've got a question here from the audience. I haven't got a name, but and I'm going to just synthesize it, because it's about the decision not to allow coal and gas into the capacity mechanism, which was made last week at the energy, state and territory and federal energy ministers, the day before they intervened into the market. I'm sure lots of you know, but is what Tony referred to as being missed a bit because of the bigger decision to intervene into the market, and how can AEMO run that system if they're excluded? What's your view on that?
Well, when Josh Frydenberg was energy minister, he tried to push through, and to be fair, Malcolm Turnbull at the same time, pushed through a concept called the National Energy Guarantee, which took the two fundamental objectives that markets don't internalise very well, and governments have to do that. One was reducing emissions, and the other was maintaining a reliable system. Both. You have to do both in a sense, because defining what you mean by reliability for most of us is hard, and most of us would disagree what we mean anyway. So they failed completely. They then gave the Energy Security Board, which they invented for this purpose partly, the idea of saying, well, you guys need to come up with a version of this which would actually maintain reliability. That was, we want dispatchable capacity, something's got to be there when we get to very high levels of renewables. The Energy Security Board then consulted with industry for 5 years and got absolutely nowhere. Partly because industry couldn't agree what the problem was, if there was a problem, and partly because when they ever come up with any sort of solution, part of government didn't want a bar of it. And so then the minister said, well, we better take it over and we'll design the capacity mechanism. What they've designed is something different. They haven't designed what I've just been talking about at all. What they've designed, as far as I can see, is a shortcut way of trying to they'll underpin some of what they call firmed renewables. That is, they're going to go out to market and say, right, we want you to supply firm renewables, which means renewables with some form of storage. Can't have gas, can't have coal. Now, some states may be uncomfortable with that, who think we do need some gas and coal, because I'm pretty sure that nowhere in the world has this ever been tried before.
Really?
Most capacity markets have some form of capacity that you can say, you need to be here in 3 years' time during the peak demand period, and you need to be signed up financially to deliver. Right now, there's very few renewable projects could actually go anywhere near that commercially. I mean, you can talk about having batteries and pumped hydro, but when it comes down to someone writing a contract that they will be on the hook for, if they don't supply that, then you end up with gas and you end up with things like even diesel. Now, it may very well be that hydrogen, it may very well be that even compressed air and some other technologies can do that. But I don't see how you do that. So what they've designed is a version of a capacity. They're calling it a capacity investment scheme. They're being very careful not to call it a capacity market, because it's not. And so we'll get part of what's necessary, but at some point, I hope in the not too distant future, we're going to have to revisit that. And I mean, that's pragmatically what they've done is a pretty clever political job, but it's not solving the problem that is behind this capacity market requirement.
It's really interesting. Zoe, earlier you were saying, you mentioned that we need to look at perhaps new financial models as well. What can we learn from Silicon Valley? You mentioned Silicon Valley and it just piqued my interest. Are there lessons for financial models going into this?
Yeah, I mean, hang on, let me turn my thing on again. Here we go. So in a sense, will be a bit boring here, because the thing that we can learn from, there's two things that we can learn from Silicon Valley. One of them is capital at risk, right? And Silicon Valley is pretty unique there. They've got a right to play. They've got all the world's capital at risk sitting there looking at Silicon Valley going, what could we possibly give you money to try next? So that's a big difference between us and Silicon Valley, but it's not necessarily a difference we can bridge. The other thing that's really that you don't see about Silicon Valley, actually, and I'm sorry, I'm going to be repetitive here, they have an extraordinary policy system sitting underneath Silicon Valley. So if you're a startup, Silicon Valley, state funding to start off with, not arena funding, which is matched 6 months worth of grant process, then maybe we'll take it back if it doesn't work. It's not going to work for a startup, or it'll work for some, but not for many. Then next step, maybe you've got a product, you want to test it. 170 labs across the University of California system will test your product depending on what it is and won't charge you much for it or anything for it. All right, now you've got a product, great, good. You've got to get it to scale. How do you do that? Manufacturing scale support program provided by the state. Gets you from the first unit to the first 100,000 units or whatever the scale you need happens to be, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then they decided they were going to go for transport. Obviously do a lot of other stuff, but for as is relevant for transition, they do transport. And they did that because it was a huge part of their emissions footprint as a state they couldn't deal with. And they basically went all the way through the transport system and put a RET, a demand target, a purchasing requirement on every single step of the system. So whether you're the guy at the fuel station buying the fuel to sell to the customer, you got a target. If you're the person who sells the cars to the customer, you got a target. If you're the person who installs the chargers, you got a target. Everyone's got a target. So it didn't just say the market will do it and then wonder why no one wants to buy an EV because there aren't any chargers, or there aren't enough EVs and they're all too expensive, or there aren't any batteries for the EVs if you need to fix them, or there's no one to fix the EVs. They didn't let that stuff to chance. They just said, do the whole system and then no piece of it is going to fall down. So that's a bit annoying because it's not a finance answer. But
but it's actually a better policy answer.
It's a much better policy answer. But the other thing I would say is, to the point that Michael made about some of the things we take for granted, I mentioned before infrastructure funding. We're really used to the idea now that Macquarie Bank or a whole bunch of other people will turn up and say, we will own part of your toll road. But that didn't used to be a thing you did. And in fact, if you speak to infrastructure people globally today or read any of the latest infrastructure reports, they will all say, oh my word, we have the same problem. We need to create new infrastructure assets. A lot of them are in developing world. How on earth do we get private capital to go against those assets? And that's an example, particularly in Australia. Australia has one of the highest per GDP infrastructure spends on the chart. And that's one of the things we've been very successful at. And in fact, it started largely here. So the whole thing that we think is really normal, which is that type of infrastructure financing, it doesn't always work, don't get me wrong, but that's this financial innovation that happened largely here and that has been hugely effective in crowding in private capital. And so that's the other thing that's on my mind. And I have to say, I haven't got the model yet, but that's the other thing we're focused on is how do you create models like that could be completely normal in 3 decades time, or go, yeah, of course we've got an infrastructure financing industry, but that allow you to put capital down against stuff, particularly proactively.
Michael, you mentioned in your presentation the rate of uptake that we're going to need to have at a sort of domestic, if I can call it, level, right? That sort of, and your figures were staggering when you compare, just how often, as you say, we change things in our kitchens or our air conditioners, which is not frequent. It segues to what Tony said, which is, you can have targets, but you need the darts, you need the board, you actually need to. Are we going to have to be a bit more specific about those targets? And there's a lot of politics around all of that, but are we going to have to build that around all of these consumables?
I think yes. And I think to Zoe's point, it really follows on from Zoe's point. And the Californian example is a really good one. So, for example, if the average home needs to have an EV in it in 15 years' time, and all these other things, you could easily spend $100,000 or more over the next 10 years, 10, 15 years, achieving all of those things. So then if I am one who needs to get an EV, but I can't quite afford it, how do we cover that? So for example, this gets into the fuel economy standards or emission standards for all passenger vehicles, where Tony's point about our recent baby steps on this, giving EVs similar tax treatment to Hiluxes and other things. I think it's a retrograde step. I'd prefer to get rid of all of those favourable tax treatments and go back to something which is a more sensible way of achieving mitigation of the passenger vehicle and other road vehicle fleets. So we'll need to have passenger vehicle mandates. But is it hard? Is it not hard? On passenger vehicles, right now globally, more than 80% of all cars sold today are into markets that have a mandated fuel economy or CO2 target. We don't have one. Chinese do, Americans do, Europeans do, UK does. 80% of new cars already have it.
Honestly, I've covered this for 20 years, but it's still it hurts my brain that it could be possible that we could be so far behind on something like that. You're
going to try really hard, right?
How can we even think to catch up then? We talk about being a superpower.
Getting on with it.
We're just treading water, aren't we?
Well, yes, we have been, but going back to Zoe's point, Zoe's talking about EV targets, but passenger vehicles, energy efficiency standards, uptake of induction cookers, all of these things, there is, and these standards or targets are ways of managing risk for people who are going to finance and people who are going to buy them, right? So we need to just be looking at this in many different sectors. I think that's exactly right. Zoe's point's exactly right.
I think the other thing you've got to do just to that is it does, to your point, a lot of other places have got a stock of policy. They've been building it for ages. We've just been cancelling it. We make a new one every few years and then we get rid of it. And it's been our fun thing for a while. To get from there and to get on with it, we do also have to focus. So instead of going, oh my God, there's 28 clean energy possible things, oh, let's do all of them. We're probably going to have to go, no, let's do 3. Let's get really, really good at green hydrogen, battery manufacture for export to India and the US, and add another one, rather than going, I'm going to try and do absolutely everything that's on the list because it's exciting and we're a superpower.
Yes, that's an interesting point. Tony, we've got a question and I've even got a name. I love it when I have a name, Tom. And Tom wants to ask you, how does the cost of producing electricity from renewables compare to producing electricity from fossil fuels?
It's sort of, in a weird way, the wrong question.
That's Tom's question, Tony.
Tom, the right answer to the question is,
Tom is always right.
How does the cost of getting it to the where you want it compare? Because the cost of producing wind and solar energy is already well below the cost of fossil fuels. And particularly if we're going to replace the coal-fired power stations we've got now, if you wanted to replace them with new coal-fired power stations, wind and solar would be cheaper. The challenge is that part of that question about having done the easy stuff, the cost of building the transmission and storage to maintain a reliable system will largely offset the cost of the renewables. So anyone who tells you that this is going to be easy or cheap is wrong. Anyone who tells you it's impossible or expensive or too expensive is wrong, because they're not doing the sort of analysis Michael's done. So that's where the answer lies. Now, we can get from where we are now, close down all the coal-fired power stations and be at, probably most of the way to the current Labor target of by 2030, which is 82% renewables. We'll get most of that direction, and the system costs, total costs, will not be much different from what they are today. The last bit probably is going to, as we see the numbers today, looks harder. But of course, we all know that's not the lens to look through it, because anyone who thought, when we looked at go back not very long, 10 years, when solar was really expensive and gas was really cheap, look what happens when those two switch, right? So these things will change. And as people give people the incentives to start investing and innovating in the areas that Zoe's talking about, and Michael, the technologies Michael's talking about, it will happen and we will solve some of those problems, but they're not going to be trivial. And, when governments start promising we're going to save this much by this time in the future, just don't believe them. It's not going to happen. No one will prove it anyway, but we can make this progress. And it will not be painful, and we will maintain a reliable and affordable electricity system.
I'd love to hear from you too, but you can put your hand up and ask it. There you go. Someone has. Didn't take long.
Thanks very much, Jeff Robinson. There's been a lot of some discussion around the built environment that's happening at a domestic level, the changes in cookers and things like that. But I'd be interested in your thoughts on what has to happen at a sort of systematic level in the construction industry, how we can get our embodied emissions down and also substantially increase the quality of housing and building standards in this country when you look at and compare them to what's happening in other parts of the world. Just come back from Ireland, and every house is being sort of externally insulated and upgraded, and yet this country, a lot of times people are living in glorified tents. So I think there's a lot of potential in this industry around that. You haven't sort of spoken much about that, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on how that industry needs to transform.
Michael?
That's a very good point. And I haven't talked too much about the details of the modelling because it's just pages and pages of it. That strong electrification scenario we talked about has very strong energy productivity measures in it across everything, including building energy efficiency, electrification, all sorts of stuff in it, such that we think it's with such kinds of many different kinds of efforts that you describe, we can keep domestic energy consumption at about current levels as we decarbonise over the next 30 years, while we increase the population by 50%. Now, we may not increase the population by 50%, we might do it by less, in which case it makes the job easier. I agree with you entirely, and the houses I've stayed in Ireland and United Kingdom, they have a big advantage that they have a greater need to insulate them more in Ireland than we do in Australia, for example. Absolutely, but historically they're better at it, right? And like in North America as well. The other one I think is with electric vehicles. I love electric vehicles, particularly trains, maybe buses and other things. So public transport, town planning, as well as building energy efficiency and energy productivity have enormous roles to play, quite rightly.
Got a question over here. It's just, here actually, but we can also take that one and then we might have to finish up.
Thanks. I'm Ian Blair, and I'm an agriculturalist, and seeing Tony mention that agriculture grows trees. Agriculture's highest level of productivity. We've adjusted to drones and so forth. You mentioned about seaweed, we can feed that through a trough. I wonder whether by looking at agriculture on such a large scale, where increasing trees and things on agricultural land increases productivity by 20%, whether really pushing agriculture, we can do a lot to meet our targets. And for Patricia, Landline does a fantastic job on promoting. We need a good extension service in agriculture. So comments from both of you.
I think the evidence right now is very strong that the one area of our economy that's very keen to be part of the solution is the agricultural sector. I mean, a number of the subsectors in agriculture have got much stronger targets to reduce emissions than the government has. There was a big split in the farming community and the National Party over this issue, because the farming community, they live with climate change every day, right? So there's a huge amount happening. Now, even though a significant proportion, if not 70% of the emissions from agriculture come from enteric fermentation processes, there's some of the other things you can be done on farm as well. There are, as you say, also the co-benefits that come when you start to improve the productivity of your land, because we've taken carbon out of the soil for 200 years. It's not trivial to put it back. In fact, we're probably losing carbon as a result of climate change. So putting that back is tricky. And there's huge, as I'm sure you'll appreciate, huge divergence of views about how cost effective that will be. But I think, land-based activity is very, very important. And the agricultural sector's up for it. And also because they know that if we're going to see other countries imposing carbon border adjustment mechanisms on the stuff they buy from us, one of them is going to be our agricultural produce. So it's in our economic interests to actually be part of this as well. So I think agriculture absolutely is part of the solution.
I'm going to take your question and then we'll finish up.
Thanks. Might need a translator for the Scottish accent, but Martin Rice, Research Director, Climate Council. So look, as a climate scientist, I really get frustrated with the fact that we don't put up front the challenge, the crisis we're in. Let's face it, you know, we just need to get on with it. This is about our survival we're talking about. So my question is, we need to fast track, obviously, and it's hugely challenging. How do we overcome the tension between doing the right thing from an environmental, cultural, First Nations perspective and getting the approvals in place for the large scale projects that we need to do in this country?
Tricky is to recognise that they're the same thing. They're not actually opposing each other. That the economic benefit of doing this achieves the environmental benefit as well. And we've not yet come to grips with that properly. I mean, the sort of stuff that Zoe was putting up and that Michael's underpinned technically we can do, we'll deliver that. And I think this government is just beginning to see how that might happen. Now, they're a long way from doing it yet because they're still stuck in, well, the climate war, we didn't do so well. We've got to be very careful. We don't have, you know, EV standards, we'll get killed on the save the ute from the weekend, all that sort of stuff, right? That's going to play out. I don't think as much as it did before. And I think right now, industry is behind all this, right? The community is behind it. And I think most of the politicians are as well. So I think this is a hugely interesting opportunity, time in our history.
Yeah, and I think that point you made, Tony, in your presentation about the fact that people are living climate change now. I feel like there's been a big shift as a radio presenter, just in terms of the feedback I get, because people are, it's not some sort of imagined future anymore. They're living Armageddon. Look at the flood situation this year. This is like people are in their fourth floods. They're not sort of imagining the future. They're living the future and they know it's going to get worse. So I do think we're in a moment in time because people are living it. So you wanted to say something, I know.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things about it in the center of it is that it's not actually a zero trade-off situation. And a lot of the time, maybe it is, maybe we're going to pull something out of the hat and suddenly be able to satisfy all those stakeholders at once. We haven't figured out how to do it yet. I think to your point and to Tony's point, having what you might, if you're a corporate, call real cost accounting, which is that thing's costing us money over there. And every time we do one of those and actually get to connect the two is something we've got to get better at a national level so we can bring that story to life. And I think the experience piece is important as well. But the other thing that is kicking around a lot at the moment is the idea of special zones. And I know that we've got activation zones in certain places. We've got special economic zones in other regions, and they've had a lot of contentions around them. But as far as the pragmatics of actually getting it done, that keeps coming up over and over again, which is, can you take a zone and do the approval for the zone, rather than having to do this approval for every single piece of infrastructure that has to go into the zone? And that doesn't make it a zero cost, zero trade-off situation, but it might allow you to do the thinking about the trade-offs faster and with more synergy than you normally would be able to do it.
Just very briefly, and that's exactly right. I was going to raise the same thing. If you talk to different groups, Indigenous people looking after Indigenous estate, biodiversity, farmers, there's a lot of very sophisticated thinking already happening and implementation around special zones, other things that I actually think is quite remarkable. And it's a real privilege when we're doing this project, we're consulting with all these groups, you're learning how much is actually already happening.
We're out of time, so I have to cut it off there. I know more people who had questions. I apologise that we couldn't get to all of them, but I think it's pretty healthy that we had more than that we could, you know, we were certainly not scrambling. I want to thank our panel, obviously very excellent presentations. I'm Patricia Karvelas. That brings our session to an end. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Patricia.